Robin James is a writer, editor, and independent scholar. Her fifth book, Good Vibes Only, Phenomenology and the Biopolitics of Algorithmic Legitimation, is under contract with Duke University Press. It's that book that this is going to inform a lot of the talk. Her previous books include The Future of Rock and Roll, 97XWOXY, and the Fight for True Independence, UNC Press 2023, The Sonic Episteme, Acoustic Resonance, Neoliberalism and Biopolitics, Duke University Press 2019, Resilience and Melancholy, Pop Music, Feminism and Neoliberalism, 2015, and The Conjectural Body, Gender, Race, and the Philosophy of Music, Lexington Books 2010. Her writing has appeared in venues such as Jezebel, The Guardian, Los Angeles Review of Books, Real Life, Belt Magazine, The New Inquiry, Sounding Out Hypatia, Differences, and the Journal of Popular Music Studies, as well and elsewhere across the internet. She's an expert in feminism, gender, race, and popular music, pop music and politics, sound studies, electronic dance music studies, and contemporary continental philosophy, especially critical theories of neoliberalism and biopolitics. She's also working, and I'm very interested to hear about this, on a 6-book project about the alt-rock to alt-right pipeline. I love this term, by the way. I would like to, you know, I like that. It's a nice term.
Why
phrase.
would Stock 99 look like January 6th?
I'm super interested in this. Okay, anyway. Tonight, she is going to present a talk called No Norms, Just Vibes, How Algorithms and 21st Century Anti-LGBTQ plus Moral Panics Are Reshaping the Policing of Gender, Race, and Sexuality. I would ask you all to please join me in welcoming Robin James.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Ed, for having me out here. It's a real honor to share this work with you. As Ed mentioned, this is kind of a zoomed out big picture view of my book in progress. All right, so while we are looking at this slide, if you would like to contact me, there's my Twitter, Never Calling It X handle, and my email and website. So I'll just dig in. As Vivian Lamb wrote in a November 2021 piece in Real Life magazine, internet subcultures are developing, quote, new ways of defining and embodying gender as something less like a binary characteristic or even an item in a list of options and more like a vibe, close quote. According to Lamb, social media users across various platforms are playfully rescripting gender's traditional language of binary identification into a broad spectrum of qualitative orientations. As a vibe, gender is, as Lamb puts it, quote, both an atmosphere and oneself in relation to that atmosphere, a self and its context, each mutually informing the other, close quote. From this perspective, gender is the resonance between a person and their present milieu. And because our milieus are flexible and dynamic, Lamb argues that this approach to gender offers people a less restrictive, more creative, and empowering way to experience gender than the traditional cis-heteropatriarchal binary does. Lamb isn't the only person on the internet who sees gender's vibification as a positive development. For example, the account for queer social media platform Lex tweeted in December 2020, "Are you a boy or a girl? I am a vibe." And in a June 2021 TikTok, non-binary bimbo influencer Griffin Maxwell Brooks posted a video with the description, "No gender, just vibes," where they say, quote, "I'm not a man, right? But I'm also not a woman. Forget gender. I am a vibe," close quote. In August 2021, Chingy wrote about the Twitter trend/controversy of describing celebrities as having a non-binary vibe. Although Nay notes that it was a matter of debate within the queer, trans, and non-binary communities whether, quote, it was disrespectful and harmful to categorize a gender identity as a vibe or a style, close quote, it is significant that non-binary was the gender identity singled out by Twitter users as a vibe. In October 2021, Vanessa Friedman describes fashion's turn away from sex appeal and towards a politics of gender agnosticism, a vibe. And over on Reddit, vibe is the preferred language for talking about any sort of extra-binary gendered experience. There's even a Gender Kills My Vibe design available on Amazon, TeePublic, and many other purveyors of print-on-demand apparel sites. Across the internet, no gender, just vibes appears like a positive move away from oppressive binaries. So they say. I'm going to say something different. Instead of liberating us from traditional patriarchal gender norms, vibes upgrade the old binary into terms more compatible with the way contemporary algorithms fueling contemporary technologies like TikTok and Spotify work. Today, I will show that instead of liberating us from traditional patriarchal gender norms, vibes upgrade the old binary into terms compatible with internet culture, both qualitatively and quantitatively. So first, the math behind much of AI and ML models. They model reality as atmospheres or as orientations. Instruments like recommendation algorithms model data spatially as vectors, that is, as linear spatial orientations. When the algorithms treat gender as a vibe, the results are not always as progressive as the no gender just vibe crowd makes them out to be. Second, as John Cheney-Lippold, who's a media studies scholar at Michigan, has shown, algorithms treat binary genders as malleable categories whose boundaries shift in response to feedback from the individuals grouped as either men or women. In other words, algorithms draw flexible boundaries around binary gender categories by modeling the way individuals and contexts mutually inform one another. Thinking of gender as a vibe may move us beyond old-fashioned and inflexible binaries, but it also moves us toward perceiving ourselves in the same sexist and racist ways that tech perceives us today. So first I'm going to talk about the sort of qualitative side of this, which is kind of vibes discourse on the internet. Okay? So what is a vibe? If you've been on the internet lately, you've probably seen and or heard someone talk about vibes. On social media platforms such as Twitter and Instagram, the hashtag vibes is commonly used to describe images of collected or collaged images and collages of photographs. These sorts of social media collages break vibes down into their constituent parts, which makes them especially helpful in dissecting the vibe's underlying logic, right? So you can see there's like, in the posts over here, there's collections of objects within a single photo or collections of photos in a single post, right? But there's kind of a grouping or a collage. This style of social media post uses a collection of images or objects to create a visual milieu, which is then described with a series of hashtags. For example, the purpley Instagram post tags a picture of incense, crystals, and spiritual symbols with the vibes hashtag. The bluish Instagram post uses the vibes hashtag to categorize an image of a reflective crystal ball lying where the water meets the sand on the beach on a bright sunny day. The two tweets on the slide create a gallery of 3 or 4 photos of everyday things: a farmer's market stall, a sleeping infant, an earring in the top post, and a fence line in a grassy yard, a dog, and a red flower in the other one. So what all of these sort of collages are doing are plotting out a vibe, right? Or literally like an orientation or a horizon, okay? This technique of presenting a curated collection of objects or images and naming it a vibe isn't limited to 2D social media. And I never know how to pronounce this guy's name. Kyle Shaika explains in his New Yorker piece on TikTok vibes. In one video, quote, a woman demonstrated her morning routine with shots of rumpled linen bed sheets, navy blue satin pajamas, a steaming mug of matcha, along with brief glimpses of other objects: a monstera plant, a burning chunk of Palo Santo, a busy street outside. Altogether, they evoked a mood of calm, enlightened, prettified productivity. The video was hashtagged vibes, close quote. So on TikTok, collections of images and scenes unfold over time and are often accompanied by a soundtrack. Sometimes these soundtracks are audio memes, and sometimes they are a clip of a song used to evoke a particular mood, such as the positive, cute, and nature feel of a video of ladybugs crawling around on someone's hand. But most often, the vibes hashtag on TikTok in particular seems to be included in dance videos that aspire to virality much in the same way that the FYP or For You page hashtag is used to game the platform's notoriously opaque algorithm governing what appears on users' For You page. So, in other words, TikTok users will use the vibe hashtag because it's popular, and including it in their video's description can help the video's own popularity, right? Vibe is a way to associate a video with other popular things, even if the content is very different, right? So in this usage, vibe indicates something that is oriented to or in affinity with other viral content, collaging TikTok videos together in the same way that the Twitter and Instagram posts from the previous slide collaged, imaged, and objects. So here's the vibes hashtag pulls together TikTok posts that have a shared vibe of virality. And then they all use the same generic hashtag like vibe or vibes or vibe. The rest of the text in the Twitter and Instagram posts here show each post evokes specific feelings, affects, or tones. Feelings, affects, or tones, which are generated by what the things each image includes are and how or where they are arranged, right? So there's a vibe, but then there's other verbal descriptions of them. And so what this shows is that a vibe is not itself a mood or an affect. It's an orientation that points you towards some particular moods or affects and away from others. That's why you have to specify the particular feelings. Does that make sense? Right? So like the market vibes over there, being at the farmer's market orients you to, feeling things like nature or community or whatever, and probably less like artifice or technology maybe, right? So as the use of the vibes hashtag on TikTok to create affinities among posts suggests, vibes don't even have to have an affective content or component. Here, to vibe is to be in alignment with other viral posts. As alignments to or away from various possibilities, vibes are what philosophers would call a phenomenological orientation. I'll explain the phenomenology part more later in the talk, but for now I want to discuss the math behind systems like TikTok's recommender algorithm and show how it models basically the same kind of spatial relationship. And I had to talk to many mathematicians about this because the last math class I took was in '94, so there was a lot of learning here for me. So hopefully I can explain it in a... Right, so why vibes now? So scholars studying the intersection of tech and capitalism have noted a shift toward mathematical models that depict qualitative milieus, horizons, or if you will, vibes. As economic sociologist Lisa Atkins argues in her book, The Time of Money, finance capitalism has reworked money and debt so they function not as quantity, volume, quantum, or substance, but as heterogeneous processes that surround life, that is, as milieus or ambient situations. Similarly, as Eli Ayachi writes in The Blank Swan, The End of Probability, quote, the trader's work is poetic, a performative capacity that is singular and non-reproducible to the extent that the trading individual, like the Wall Street trader, he means, is so much himself that he has to be there in order that the market may be, close quote. In other words, Ayachi argues that markets are phenomenological horizons shaped through the mutual orientation of traders and their environs. Likewise, Fiona Allen explains in her article, The Wealth of Affect, Financial Speculation as Everyday Habitus, quote, emotional life has become an important object target for technologies of surveillance, intervention, and capital accumulation, close quote, as evidenced in everything from, quote, the public measurement of consumer confidence to attempts to engineer a specific public mood, close quote. And you remember a couple weeks ago, the New York State governor sent the National Guard to the subways, and she said, yeah, I don't care about crime statistics. This is about like people's feelings, right? This is exactly what I'm pointing to. Who cares about the actual data? It's just, feelings trump statistics sort of thing, right? So over the past few decades, there has been a broad shift across tech and finance to forms of calculation that supplement Gaussian models, right? So Gaussian models are the bell curve, right, that we're all probably familiar with, especially in connection to like Charles Murray and scientific racism and stuff like that, right? So the math used in tech and finance today supplements Gaussian models of probability with Bayesian ones. Whereas Gaussian probabilities assess the frequency at which risk events like death or debt default happen in a defined group like a population, contemporary tech and finance are interested in risk that can't be measured in a Gaussian way because factual data about the past and present have no predictive value for presently counterfactual future scenarios. Like, what do you want to listen to next? Or what do users like you also buy, right? So these sort of recommender systems are trying to predict a future that doesn't exist yet, right? And they can't use patterns in past data to do it. So they're trying to model a different kind of relationship. As Louise Amor explains, in these speculative logics, quote, the emphasis of risk assessment comes to be one of the balance of probability of future threat and occupies instead the horizon of actionable decisions. Instead of compiling past data about an event like births or deaths to find its normal rate or frequency and assess the balance of cost and benefit, these speculative logics put sub-individual fragments of information, like a few of the items in your last grocery order, together to form a phenomenological horizon from which one can make qualitative inferences about questions for which you have incomplete factual data, like what would an individual Spotify user like to listen to next? In the speculative logics behind contemporary tech and finance, phenomenological horizons function in place of the normal curve as the device used to forecast and assess risk. Okay. So, more technically, the math behind contemporary tech and finance models reality spatially as a horizon or vector. And there's an anthropologist, Nick Seaver, and I'm going to quote his work. That's the one on the bottom right for you all. He embedded himself with many music recommender companies, right? And the way that people making recommender algorithms think about what they're modeling is in space, right? So they're modeling sort of collections of points in space. So according to Seaver, speculative algorithmic processes like recommendation systems spatialize data in order to make legible a horizon from which some futures seem more plausible and others less. As Seaver explains, the math behind recommendation algorithms makes predictions on the basis of spatial configurations. And this is an example of one of them, right? So that's the old model. Frequency is rate and time, right? The bell curve. This is a new sort of more spatial model. This math, this spatial math, has its roots in the non-metric multidimensional scaling, or MDS, techniques developed by Bell Labs in the 60s and 70s. MDS models spatialized data by plotting two-factor similarity scores on an XY axis, such as a table of the distances among American cities being plotted on an XY axis, which conveniently resembles a map of the US, right? So it's literally kind of thinking in spatial terms. This has evolved in the last 50 years into something like the idea that data is inherently spatializable, as in the data science grad student Seaver quotes in the title of his article, quote, "Everything lies in space," and that image is from that article. As Seaver reports, in such an epistemic system, musical taste, as one recommender system research group had begun to theorize it, was like the gravitational deformation of an ambient cultural space-time, and that's what this graph is, right? So this is the map of two users' patterns of listening, right? Their musical taste on Spotify. And you see it's lines oriented in space, right? So recommendation algorithms and the tranching of securities, which would be more on the financial side, are illustrative examples of such speculative spatial math because they are among the clearest analogs to the type of social media posts I analyze above. So I want you to think back to those Twitter and Instagram posts of those collected objects. And these are images. I just Googled recommender algorithm explainer. And these were sort of images commonly used to illustrate how recommender algorithms work, if that makes sense, right? So in this example over here, you've got a white person with no visible hair, wearing a blue cycling kit, who ordered a pizza with mushrooms and cheese, a garden salad, and a Coke, right? And that's used as a profile for this person over here, who's also a white person with no visible hair, blue cycling kit, who ordered the same kind of pizza and the same kind of salad, right? Well, because these two profiles are similar in these collected ways, it's thought to be more likely that the user on the left is going to buy a can of Coke rather than a bottle of beer, right? So and this is another sort of representation of the similar thing, but you have like a picture of a user and a photo and a book and a TV and a game controller. So I want you to see these like data points as like analogs for the different photos, the different photos in the social media posts. So part of what I'm arguing is that, like, vernacularly, people in pop culture are constructing vibes literally in the same way that these mathematical models are trying to build predictive models for recommender systems, right? So I want to see these two as kind of quantitative and qualitative analogs for one another, okay? All right, how much did I skip ahead there? Okay. So recommendation algorithms like the one modeled here treat probability as a situated and subjective likelihood. For example, the user landing page for social video platform TikTok is populated by an algorithm that is one of the most notorious black boxes in the tech sphere. Called the For You page, or FYP, the TikTok feed is closely tailored to individual user preferences and habits. I train mine so it's techno and dogs. Right? As the company explains in a 2020 blog post, quote, "This feed is powered by a recommendation system that delivers content to each user that is likely to be of interest to that particular user. Part of the magic of TikTok is that there's no one For You feed. Each person's feed is unique and tailored to that specific individual," right? So these sorts of systems build individuals' For You pages, right? Calculated according to a weighted mix of things users actively express as preferences, such as likes, follows, hashtags, and sounds, and passive preferences, such as location and device type, the For You page algorithm caters to the idiosyncratic tendencies of a situated subject. And if you know anything about phenomenology, you can hear it sort of in here. So as critical data studies scholar Justin Joke argues in his book Revolutionary Mathematics, algorithms like TikTok's understand probability as a measure of subjective belief. Right? Whereas mathematical probability was traditionally understood as an objective measure of the rate or frequency of a variable's occurrence, today Bayesian approaches treat probability as something like a bizarro version of feminist standpoint theory, right? Where there's no one single one, it's everything situated and from a perspective. So in this model, past behavior creates a trajectory toward or away from a particular set of possibilities, like what video you want to watch next. So just as vibes are vernacular practices of modeling phenomenological orientations, the vector-based and Bayesian math used in the mathematical models driving 21st century tech platforms are qualitative methods for modeling these same sorts of orientations. And sort of the main contention of this talk and my broader book is that the sort of biopolitical model of gender, race, and sexual governance that you get in Foucault's work in the 70s is about the Gaussian curve and norms, right? Norms and normalization. And what I'm saying is we have new math and also a new discursive equivalent to the norm, and that's the vibe, right? All right, so, and I think especially Sarah Ahmed's concept of phenomenological orientation is a helpful philosophical or theoretical tool, right? This is a queer theory program, so here's the theory to come in, for kind of thinking critically about math that I don't understand really, and vibes in pop culture. So I'm going to kind of get into the discussion of what a phenomenological orientation is. All right, orientations. So for both Sarah Ahmed and Linda Alcoff, orientation refers to one's socio-material situatedness. Ahmed argues that, quote, "If consciousness is about how we perceive the world around us, then consciousness is situated," close quote. And Alcoff describes consciousness as, quote, "a reflective awareness about the horizon of our situation," close quote. Both philosophers use situation and situatedness to describe all the affordances and limitation that location offers to facilitate and or inhibit what can do, think, or be. Thinking back to the second sex, right? Patriarchy as a concrete material and social situation makes some things easier to reach for women and others harder. Women who exhibit traditionally cis feminine orientations will have an easier time following through on their orientations, whereas women whose orientations are aligned differently will have a much more difficult time following through their aims, and so on. So one way to think about an orientation, do I have this on the slide? I can't remember if I put this on the slide. Did anybody do perspective drawings in like elementary school art class? That's one way to think about this, right? Here's the first person perspective, and then the lines show your orientation and things. Some things are closer and bigger and others are farther away, right? Putting some things closer into reach, others less easy to reach. This is also kind of a summary of Ahmed's queer phenomenology. And I'm kind of glossing a lot so that we definitely have more time for talk. All right, so if we think about an orientation working more or less like a perspective drawing, a visual perspective drawing, we can say that although this example of pictorial perspective might suggest that horizons are primarily spatial, they are also temporal. As Ahmed explains, horizons are performative in the Butlerian sense. They depend on the repetition of norms and conventions, of routes and paths taken, but they are also created as an effect of this repetition, close quote. Subjects become oriented by iterative experiences. For example, and I can tell I wrote this right after I moved into a new place, when you move house, it takes a while to align yourself with your new space, to gain the muscle memory to navigate your way from your bed to the washroom in the dark without running into anything. We align ourselves with our living spaces through the repeated interactions with them. And whereas feminist philosophy has traditionally understood this iterativity or performativity as an opening to subvert gender norms, and this is Butler's argument in Gender Trouble, John Cheney-Lippold, who I mentioned earlier as this media studies scholar of algorithmic culture, shows that algorithms treat normative categories as themselves iterative. Contemporary algorithmic governance co-opts performativity's once subversive potentiality with respect to norms and turns it into a mode of more fine-grained surveillance and control. Though horizons are performative, such performativity does not offer the subversive potential it once had. And I'm just kind of glossing here to move things along. So Cheney-Lippold says that the math has changed how norms function, and I'm saying that's right, but not quite complete, right? It's not that norms work differently, it's that we're using something different than norms. It's not a norm. So how does this work to govern people? So Ahmed's account of sexual orientation draws on Judith Butler's discussion of performativity, which is rooted in Foucault's account of norms. Butler's well-known argument is that norms are performative. I'm going to skip here because I think this crowd is probably familiar with that. Although Ahmed begins from Butler's account of performativity, her theory of orientation pushes beyond Butler's normative framing toward an account of power that uses logics of legitimation to govern speculative probabilities. In describing the body's iterative performance of its orientation, Ahmed argues that, quote, the normative can be considered an effect of the repetition of bodily actions over time, which produces what we can call the bodily horizon, a space for action, which puts some objects and not others in reach, close quote. By performing a specific orientation, I create a milieu or landscape of possibilities for actions, opportunities that are more or less realizable or probable. And although this is not her intention, Ahmed implicitly develops an account of how horizon and orientation govern sexuality with tools and processes that aren't norms. First, if the body's orientation determines its possibilities for movement and action, then orientation governs subjects' probable capacities. That is, what it is easier and more difficult for that specific body in that specific situation to do, right? So this is the same kind of model of probability that we get with the recommender system, right? So for example, understanding sexuality as an orientation rather than a norm means that the differences between how we are oriented sexually are not only a matter of which objects we are oriented towards, but also how we extend through our bodies into the world, close quote. So traditionally, queer and straight track the difference between abnormal and normal object choice, like quite literally. And as Ahmed argues here, they can also track the difference between a debilitated and a capacitated body, and that's kind of where Jasbar Pour's most recent book goes, right? So although she does not state this point, the difference between normal and abnormal object choice does not always coincide with the differences between a capacitated or a debilitated orientation. So, and I'm going to quickly gloss an example here. I live in Connecticut, and my spouse teaches at a private high school. The queer kids at that private high school have a very different reality than queer kids in public high school in Florida, right? So it's not, their sexual object choice that defines sort of their relation to cis heteropatriarchal power, right? It's literally their situated orientation, right? Are you in Connecticut or are you in Florida? Are your parents rich or are they not rich, right? Are you white or are you not white? Things like this, right? So there's a very clear move from just governance through object choice to governance through situation. All right. So, Ahmed's discussions of debt and inheritance further clarify that orientations governed by distributing possibilities and capacities in line with the distribution of private wealth. Orientations are heritable because children's situations are effectively identical to their parents or guardians. As Ahmed explains, quote, children inherit the proximity of certain objects as that which is available to us as given within the family home. These objects are not only material, they may be values, capital, aspirations, projects, and styles. Insofar as we inherit that which is near enough to be available at home, we also inherit orientations. That is, we inherit the nearness of certain objects more than others, which means we inherit ways of inhabiting and extending into space. To inherit one's parents' orientation means to inherit their degree of debility or capacity within their situation. For example, in the US, postal code is a more accurate determinant of future health than DNA, right? So it's literally not your biology that is a better predictor of your future health. It's your situation, right? Where you live and with whom. So Ahmed means when she says that we inherit our parents' orientations as determinants of our abilities to extend into space, right? That's what she means there. So regardless of your connection to your biological parents, the situation one finds oneself thrown into as a child orients one's present and future possibilities. So orientations are not biologically heritable like genes, which is what the sort of biopolitical governance of sexuality in Foucault was all about, right? It was that sort of meeting point of, individual sexual practice and the health of the population. The language of debt pervades Ahmed's discussion of the heritability of orientation. As she explains, quote, the concept of orientations allow us to expose how life gets directed in some ways rather than others through the very requirement that we follow what is already given to us, close quote. Parents and communities give individuals orientated situations as a kind of inheritance, and those gifts are what Ahmed calls, quote, social investments, direct one towards specific things and away from others in order to reproduce the capacities and situations they have been gifted. As an investment, orientations are expected to bring returns, and when they do not, they create a debt. For example, she claims, quote, heterosexuality becomes a social as well as familial inheritance through the endless requirement that the child repay the debt of life with its life. The child who refuses the gift thus becomes seen as a bad debt, as being ungrateful, as the origin of bad feelings. And she doesn't say vibes, but she might as well. In the context of contemporary patriarchal racial capitalism, orientations are quite literally a form of human capital, and they are doled out with the expectation that this investment of human capital will produce more and more of it. Following a different orientation than the one you inherit from your family puts you out of line with what is held to be the proper transfer of wealth and property. So if orientations are inherited as a form of property, then their transfer is governed the same way the inheritance of property is governed. That is, along social, political, and juridical lines of legitimacy. I use legitimate in the sense that Melinda Cooper does in Family Values, where it refers to phenomena that occur within the explicit boundaries of a traditionally legally sanctioned relationship. Right? So quickly she says, and she's thinking, this is her sort of read on neoliberal responses to the AIDS crisis, where she says, well, what happened was white gay men were given access to credit, which they suddenly hadn't been before, and then this creates the shift in gay activism towards marriage, right? Because marriage is the way to legally protection the inheritance of wealth, right? So there's this shift from the normative or non-normative relation or behavior to the legitimate or illegitimate relationship. So, okay, yeah. So I'm gonna shift here to an example of legitimacy because we are coming up on time. So if you think of norms, the normativity of object choice shifting to the governance of the legitimacy of relations, you can even see this in how moral panics about sex and sexuality have changed. I grew up in the 80s and 90s, so I kind of remember the Parents Music Research Council, the Robert Mapplethorpe controversy, Larry Flint, stuff like that. So moving on to that. So norms are tricky and inefficient tools for neoliberal regimes because they don't work well with privatization. Although qualitative disciplinary norms target individuals and their behaviors with quantitative norms reflect the composition of a population, both sorts of norms are indexed to a public or a population. Disciplinary norms are universal standards to which all must conform, and statistical norms track the frequency of a variable in a defined group. Obscenity is an example of a norm that appeals to a public. In US law, obscenity, it was determined in the case Miller versus California. Something is obscene. This is the tool that judges should use in determining whether something is obscene. So first, whether the average person applying, and this is the key language, contemporary community standards, right? An average in a community would find that work taken as a whole appeals to the prurient interest, right? So a norm in this sense appeals to a public. But if you're in a neoliberal regime and you basically want to get rid of the state and the public, you can't use that as a standard. You need something else. I think what we're getting now is vibes and orientations, right? And the way that you see this cashing out in terms of anti-LGBTQ plus moral panics would be this move towards the criminalization of queer sexuality, right, or queer existence, right? And that's what the groomer sort of moral panic is about. It's not that your behavior offends some sort of commonly held standard, but it's illegal, right? It's a legitimate or illegitimate relationship, right? So you see that in, the attempts to outlaw drag performance in public. You see that in just the whole groomer moral panic generally. You also see this in, I think, state abortion bans, right? It's making it illegitimate to be someone perceived as potentially pregnant, right? So the broad move towards criminalization of gender and sexual identities is, I think, how this more contemporary form of biopower is replacing the sort of normal or abnormal object choice form of governance with a form of governance that appeals to no public or civic or civil right or anything like that, right? It can exist purely within the realm of privatization, okay? So normativity hasn't gone away, right? Was it Dartmouth brought back the SAT, right? Some school brought it back. But I think normativity is not I think the more privilege you have, the less you feel the governance of normativity and the more you feel the governance of legitimation, right? So poor kids are still going to be kept out of Ivy League schools because of their SAT scores, right? So I don't think this is an either or, and we're not replacing them, but I think we're seeing like extra layers for a number of reasons: neoliberal privatization, the development of this new form of quantitative governance, that sort of thing. So yeah. No norms, just vibes, not necessarily. I'm not saying it's bad, I'm just saying it's dangerous. Haha. You've seen the Foucault Adorno meme. All right. I'm going to stop talking and take your questions. Thank you.
I want to ask your concept of normativity and criminality or legality. How are they different from our traditional ethical usage of those terms? Because I'm surprised by your use those examples from pop culture. So it seems many things are combined together. So yeah, it's hard to pin down into any traditional concept. My question, want to ask you, how different your concepts? For example, normativity, of course, can be used beyond ethical realm. But if in ethics, it's ethical norm, right? So what's the concept that I forgot? The orientation. I like that concept. So there's another question, I'm sorry. How do you distinguish your orientation from ethical guidance? Ethical norm? Is orientation a guide, a directionality? If you allow, I to connect them?
Yeah, I think I understand. So like, yeah, is an orientation, like what do you do? Yeah.
How do you do?
How do you do?
What you should do?
Sure, yeah, and that's actually the last chapter of the book, which I just finished a first draft of. So what I argue that Beauvoir's existential phenomenology is actually the best model for thinking about like, if orientations are being used in really bad ways to oppress people, how would you think a non-oppressive model of orientation? And so I'm thinking in her book, The Ethics of Ambiguity, there's a line where she says, every action is both for and against men, right? When you do something, you're doing it for some people, but also against other people, right? So like, if you think of like the classic examples of intersectionality in Crenshaw's Mapping the Margins essay, right? The people who ran the women's shelter were trying to really help women, and they made them go to group therapy classes, but those group therapy classes happened to be in English, so immigrant women couldn't participate, right? So that choice was both for some people and against others, right? And that's that sort of language of orientation. So I think, every action is both for some and against others. And me personally, I think the fact that Beauvoir is offering this is in an existential phenomenology is important, right? Because there is no right orientation. It's just people are situated and they make choices, right? And those choices orient the world in ways that reflect the values that people appealed to at that moment. Does that make sense? Right?
Yeah,
So,
I can see your point of relativizing what is right, wrong by existential phenomenology. But I just want to ask you one more thing. So your theory is close to, for a long time, the criticism of the normality, either in ethical or epistemological discourse. The normality, we should not put too much emphasis on it, even though people like to make norms. But in reality, in your interpretation, it's not a norm. It's not a matter of norm. Or it will be imposing on people. Rather, it's happening occurrence of orientation.
yeah, and I guess I should explain that I'm also using norm in a specific technical sense that I didn't mean in the paper. So I'm drawing here in Foucault's work in like The Right to Death and the Power Over Life, and some of the work on biopolitics, where he defines norm as either a disciplinary norm, right, like created through the repeated bodily discipline, right, like I was in marching band, so I was made to stand like this, so I learned that norm, right, or norm is in a statistical norm, right, so, and those are, he argues, sort of the qualitative and quantitative analogs for one another in biopower. So when I'm talking about norms, that's what I mean specifically, right? Yeah, so I'm also not talking about like sort of normativity generally, like as in the difference between a normative and a descriptive claim or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It might help to just say this is in theories of sort of governance rather than than moral kind of like
It's broader.
rightness. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I saw. Oh, Eva. Yeah.
I'm wondering. So I understand you're using norm in a very specific sense and in Foucault's sense, but I'm still wondering why we can't say that the way that we're influenced by algorithms can't be a sort of updated kind of norm. Because I know the whole purpose was to distinguish between, it's vibes and not norms, and that this is sort of based on a different, it's not predicting based on patterns that, it's not referring backwards to patterns that can predict the future, but the algorithms operate in a different way, and so vibes operate in a different way. But why wouldn't we say that vibes have their own kind of disciplinary function that we can see, I think, in how the social order is changing and the pressures that exist in the social order. I think that's the best I can do with my question.
Yeah, I think I see the direction you're trying to go, and let me know if this is not it. So I'll go back to where I was saying, like, norms always refer to a public or a group or a population, right? And especially with these personalized algorithms, there is no, right? It's all about personalization. It's just about drilling down into your particular preferences, as weird or niche as they may be. And you sort of see this today in subcultures, right? Like, you know, like there's the aesthetics wiki that's just like a list of internet subcultures, and there's no sort of sense of like, you know, there is, you know, 18 subculture. It's just like all over the place. So I think what's also happening is that with privatization and personalization, privatization as an ideology and technique of governance, and personalization as a technological capacity, we're not getting these groups of people, like there's not a group of people to have a norm, right? There's not a universal standard. It's just even more finely drilled down individual preference, if that makes sense. Because in a certain sense, I think a norm has to appeal to a singular standard or a common standard, if that makes sense. Yeah. And to do that, you have to have a group of people for whom that is universal or common.
Right. I'm just thinking of groups of people being disciplined into certain consumer habits, or somehow disciplined through the kind of surveillance function of algorithms that then sort of group people in new ways and create new demographics, even if they're not the way they used to be normalized in the sort of more Foucault sense. But anyway, we could talk more about that later.
Preface with not a philosopher. I'm really taken with this slide. I'm going to be chewing on this for quite a while, especially sort of with the idea that vibes, which are much, much fuzzier around the edges, are paired with the worse of the two with the toxic criminality. I'm interested in just sort of thinking that the criminality, like the ones you've referenced here, they kind of reference a public, or at least like the children or the unborn. There's sort of, it seems to me they're almost referencing a public that doesn't exist, and therefore we can foist our own senses of what works on this public.
Is it a public or a victim?
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, because I think like, I mean, obviously like the abortion restrictions are claiming that like fetuses are people and they would be like murdered. Yeah. Right? So it would be a victim of a crime, right? And a lot of the, especially the groomers discourse and the library book discourse is all about like parental property rights over their children, right? Which is again about sort of private family property, private property and private family. And that's at least as far as I've been able to tell, largely the way that sort of side of the moral panic is taking shape. It's not about like, Prince is singing about premarital sex, and I don't want my children to hear that because it's obscene, which was literally what started the Parents Music Research Council stuff back in the 80s. Yeah, because it's not that like this is obscene and offensive, it's like, don't tread on me, basically. Yeah, so and that's kind of how I'm thinking about the structure, like what the wrong is here, right? It's usually about like a property right? You know, because also like, you know, the murder would be like a loss of property in person. You're violating my property in person, kind of thing like that. I hadn't thought about it before, but it is really interesting that you did point that like vibes are sort of seen as like fuzzy and loosey-goosey and malleable, but yet like when vibes are invoked, it's to bring in the National Guard, right? So it's interesting that there's that seeming,
And it seems to me that looseness would be very useful for the powers that be, because if you've got a really fuzzy edge, you can move it over anything you want.
Yeah.
As opposed to the Supreme Court giving the phrase contemporary community standards. Don't let Roberts rule on vibes.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and you see this too with like the way TSA, like they have plainclothes officers in the airports, like police, like, do you look nervous? Right? And that's gonna, you know,
Yes,
play
I'm
on
about
lots
to
of
get on an
existing
airplane.
biases. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
If I've heard correctly, it's sort of like this move about vibes is sort of a disciplinary, it's like an emergent hyper, I'm not even sure what to call it, some kind of hyper-managed emergence rather than a norm. Like it's this thing that constantly keeps moving and shaping according to the thing that it is, which is why it has a kind of ontological kind of thing, right? So does this mean that discourse, the old norms, the ones that we're all still having, by the way, the ones that we haven't figured out how to get out of,
Yeah.
does this mean that the civil discourse and all the norms and all the rest of the things that we're doing is the noise in the algorithmic system that's already been accounted for in terms of how we can negotiate in and around it?
And the algorithm is constantly updating. Yeah.
Exactly. So we can't ever get out of that place. Then I guess the question that I have, which is a slight sidestep, and I understand completely the Foucauldian analysis, thank you, but it reminds me a lot of sort of the continuing discussion of Afro-surreality, or surrealism, and the sort of way in which the permanent condition of being or isness, or however we think about this, is already absurd. And from what you're seeing, might that be a way to sort of reconceptualize, like if this is an absurd way of being, and these are the kinds of emergent ontologies that we get in the Beauvoir and these other places, might that be a way we can start to actually think about interrupting algorithms rather than staying in the noise?
That's an interesting question, and I will say, because the one part of the book that I didn't present about today is about the repeated co-optation of Black radical music aesthetics by logics of legitimation.
Exactly.
Right? So that's in part why I'm saying, like, there is no one right orientation, right? Because, like, that's just going to get co-opted again, right? So it's really just, it's not a matter of, like, finding the right or the just orientation, but it's about assessing the situation and really choosing, like, well, who am I choosing above others? Right? And that's, again, this is why I'm sort of appealing to the existential phenomenology, because if there is no one right way, well, then what sort of ethical model do we have for thinking about behaving in a situation like that?
Do you mind if I ask a quick
Sure.
follow-up? Because there's something I don't know how to word it, and I'm interested in hearing what you have to say about it. So if it's the case that we have like amorphous phenomenological liminality of vibes as a qualitative affective construction of things, and then we have algorithms that have a similar kind of mathematical construction, and they're with one another, right? So in previous work, we had sort of a false reduction of both music and algorithm to frequency ratio, right? And in this case, we have vibes and affect, like vibes, affect, and algorithm coming together. And what I'm not really, like they clearly share a thing, and this thing is clearly happening, and it's clearly always emergent. But what I'd be interested in hearing is how you're thinking about that intersection, like how they're playing with each other. So when I speak to other people, when I say things, I'm in education, like I think children are being, like we're training children to be algorithms, and we're letting AI become what we wish children to be, right? Like these sort of inversions of things. I'm wondering if you could sort of walk us through a little bit about how you get this, like if vibes are not vibes, but they're reductionary, and algorithms are reductionary. What is the mechanism by which these things intertwine linguistically? And I know we spent most of the day doing that, but I'm wondering if you could sort of help me sort of get to that intersection.
Do you mean what are the mechanisms by which vibes and algorithms interact? Or
Well, they're both sort of reductionist in this case.
Yeah.
And so is it just that they're both reductionist and vibes become a narrow thing than algorithms do, and then vibes become a
they're the
cover for it?
same kinds of, they're analogous practices of abstraction.
Okay, thank you.
Does that get to it?
That's
Yep.
it.
Okay.
Thank you.
We figured it out.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
I'm a music industry major. I was just gonna ask about like what the definition of orientation is in this context, because I was getting that it was more of, I guess, I'm trying to find the right words. Maybe like how you identify, or I was wondering if it related to gender or sexual orientation, or more in a general sense, just like, I'm not sure, is it like synonymous with like a norm or like a vibe? I'm not really sure. I was kinda confused about that.
That's a good question. And you should read Sarah Ahmed's Queer Phenomenology, because she sort of said it's an attempt to theorize sexuality as orientation. But there she sort of means like orientation literally means like I'm oriented to ed. I'm not oriented to ed, right?
So it's like your perspective.
Yeah, like your situation in social, material, historical situation, right? Like my orientation to the world is definitely shaped by the fact that I am white, that I am short, that I am cis, that sort of thing. It's also shaped by the fact that English is my first language, right? So it's literally your existence in a world, right? Points you towards some things and away from others.
Right. So is it both like how you perceive things and also how, I guess, people perceive you? So
Yeah,
like
it's a back and
combination?
forth, right? Because the world shapes me, obviously. I learned English as my first language, but I also shape the world, right? I am given, because of the hegemony of English in academic scholarship, by being a native English speaker, I'm oriented to, I have more reach and access to scholarship than I would if English was not my first language, right? So it's a kind of a back and forth thing. Does that answer your question? Awesome.
Quick follow-up question. How exactly, and maybe I missed something, but how exactly does one's orientation relate to this slide, obscenity versus criminality?
Yeah. So there are a lot of cis women athletes who are being accused of being trans, or even castrasemenia, right? Because they look a certain way, right? They have non-cis vibes maybe, because they're just good at what they do, right? How people perceive people to be oriented affects how they treat them, affects their chances, things like that in the world. Yeah, good questions. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. This was really interesting. Just a very quick question. I was wondering, I'm looking at this slide, I was wondering how a lot of the social contagion discourse sort of fits into that, because it's sort of the first thing I thought of when I saw this. So I was wondering how it would fit into this sort of dichotomy here.
Yeah, it's virality, right? Mm-hmm. It's the same sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
It's that sort of exponential spread or success that that you want on TikTok, the vibes hash, I want this to go viral, so I'll put FYP, right? I think it's that sort of analog, if that makes sense, right? Because precisely so, even the, on these platforms, the more momentum something gets, it just becomes exponential, right? Because the more reach you have, the more For You pages you're on, the more For You pages you go on to, right? So it literally is kind of a model of Contagon mathematically as well. Interesting thought, thank you.
So I am going to take a tiny bit of moderator's privilege. And part of it is I'm going to actually press you on the version of this that I heard you give before, because I think it connects to some of the things that people are asking about. So the thing that I picked up on in the last time I heard you present on this material was something you briefly touched on in this talk, but I think if you expanded on it, it might actually also help to sort of see where some of this is going, which is that you talked about the way in which the possessions that are being protected, what the sort of biopolitics of all of this actually ends up being about if it's not a public anymore. If partially because a public is something that we're trying to get rid of, and partially because a public is something that just doesn't have an ontological role to play in the way in which vibes discourses or sort of these kinds of algorithms actually work, then it becomes, I think what you talked about it at that time was a lineage that you want to protect, that you want to kind of preserve property rights to, which connects back to criminality and stuff. And so the disciplinary move, and I'm not sure you use that term, but it might be worth bringing up, or at least the biopolitical move, which you did use, you sort of said it's no longer a biopolitics of public things, it's a biopolitics of private lineages. And the goal is to sort of preserve or maintain their reproduction, right? So the reason we have moral panics over trans healthcare, especially for children, or grooming, is precisely because people don't want that sort of inflection or orientation to be transmitted or produced, right, in their children, which I think also connects to some extent, how does stuff like sexual orientation as a category get played into this. So I'm going to kind of throw that at you and see if, you maybe want to flesh out, or maybe try to tie some things together through that lens, because I think it might help.
Yeah. So another thing that can be, another example of a legitimate relation besides marriage is parenthood, right? One of the things that marriage was designed to protect was the legitimate heritability of private property, of assets into the future, right? So you see this become the increasing concern of a number of discourses. So for example, in that chapter about Black music aesthetics that I didn't talk about, I show how using musicologist Dale Chapman's book, The Jazz Bubble, he studies the rise of neoclassical jazz in the 70s. So neoclassical jazz in the 70s would be like 50s jazz, right? So 50s jazz becomes kind of trendy again in the 70s, precisely at the moment that you get like Latin American and Caribbean influences in jazz, when disco becomes an influence on jazz, right? So he sort of talks about how there is this move to sort of create this pure jazz back to the proper sort of patriarchal founders like Dexter Gordon, that was free from the influence of disco, gay people, and Afro-Caribbean, Cuban music, non-white, non-American people, right? So there's this attempt to protect the literal heritability of a patriarchal tradition from legitimate founders. You see this interestingly reproduced again in political scientist Lester Spence's analysis of hip-hop culture's adoption of neoliberalism, and he analyzes Ace Hood's Hustle Hard video. It's all about sort of like Ace Hood, the rapper, providing for his family, right? The sort of traditional patriarchal model. But interestingly, if you listen to the music in that video, so this is the precise time that Nicki Minaj hits, and there's this battle about, is she too pop? Is she real hip hop? That sort of thing. So there's the same sort of reemergence of the concern of this protection of this lineage of hip hop as a black masculine art form from interference from women. So those are more abstract examples, I think, but there's this real move towards identifying sort of a line of legitimate inheritance along broadly patriarchal lines. Could be black patriarchal lines, could be queer patriarchal lines, right? But it's really about the transmission of private property along this sort of legitimate chain of inheritance, right? So you think about this with, kids being treated as private property in groomers' discourse. Let me try to think of another example of this. Student debt is also about the transfer of wealth intergenerationally, right? Should student debt be forgiven? I mean, the way that it's totally framed in I paid off my debt, right? How dare you should just have debts forgiven, right? That sort of thing. So thanks for pressing me on. Those are some examples. Hopefully that kind of clarifies.
Yeah, we are out of time, and so I would like to come over here and
get in the picture.
Well, you can also be in the screen. So I'd like to ask everyone to help me thank Dr. James for a fascinating.